When the girl fell, it was as if the ground beneath the Vatican trembled. The Jubilee Mass had reached its most solemn moment. Beneath the towering dome of St. Peter's Basilica, incense curled through the air like ancient prayers rising from centuries of dust. The crowd, tens of thousands deep, had fallen into a silence so thick it seemed even the marble pillars were holding their breath. Cameras panned gently, reverently, capturing the Pope, the altar, the chalice, the bread, eternity hovering in human hands. Then, without warning, a sharp gasp pierced the stillness. She was young, barely 22, dressed modestly, kneeling only a few rows from the altar. No one noticed her at first. Her head had been bowed like the rest. But then her shoulders stiffened, her spine locked, and before anyone could reach for her, she collapsed, limp, wordless, as if struck by something no one could see. Not a murmur passed from her lips, not a cry. She didn't faint. She didn't convulse. She simply fell with an eerie, unnatural softness, like a flower folding in on itself just before the frost. For 3 full seconds, no one moved. A cardinal looked toward the Pope. A nun clutched her rosary until her knuckles whitened. Somewhere in the back, a camera operator whispered an oath before realizing his mic was still live. The host remained raised in Pope Leo's hands, unshaken, unspilled. His eyes, however, narrowed. He was not surprised. Not fully. He stared at the girl's still body the way one stares at a prophecy fulfilled, as if he had seen this before, not in memory, but in vision. Then came the murmurs, the guards, the stretchers, the press scrambling for angles, the Vatican attendants swarming quietly like shadows. But none of it could undo what had already been witnessed by millions, live, unedited, streaming across continents in every language known to man. Some said it was heat exhaustion, others called it hysteria. But those who were there, those who saw what happened next, would never speak of it lightly again. Because in the seconds that followed, something else stirred. Something subtle. Something unseen, but unmistakably present. A shimmer. A breath that wasn't wind. A flicker of light where no flame burned. And for those watching closely, even from their living rooms across the world, it felt as though the veil between heaven and earth had been drawn thin, terrifyingly thin. So what really happened at the altar that day? Was it divine visitation? A judgment? A test? Or a signal to those with ears to hear that something or someone has finally arrived? Before the story unfolds, consider this. If you believe the sacred still breaks into the ordinary, if you believe silence can be louder than sound, then you already know why this matters. And if you don't, if this is just spectacle to you, then ask yourself why you're still watching, why your hands haven't yet clicked away, why your heart is racing. Because heaven may have spoken, and you're not ready for what it said. He had been called the Iron Shepherd by his critics, the last light by his followers. But to most of the world, he was simply Pope Leo XIV, a man whose presence did not just command attention, but unsettled the air itself. He was not warm in the way past popes had been. He did not smile for cameras. He did not flatter world leaders. He did not soften doctrine to appease the times. Instead, he stood like a stone in a storm, unbending, deliberate, relentless. In his youth, he had washed the feet of lepers. In his 40s, he had exorcised a child in the slums of Manila with no witnesses but the angels. And now, in his 70s, he stood beneath the dome of St. Peter's, holding the Eucharist aloft while the eyes of over 100 million watched from every corner of the earth. He had not asked for this jubilee. He had declared it, not as celebration, but as warning, a call back to reverence, penance, and awe. The Church must remember her fear of God. He had written in the decree, for she will soon remember his absence. And yet, amid this solemn revival, no one expected her. She had no credentials, no titles, no invitation. Her name was Isabel Montalban, a theology student from a provincial university in southern Spain. 22 years old, quiet, known for disappearing into chapels for hours at a time. She had once told a classmate that she didn't study doctrine to win arguments. She studied it to keep from drowning. Months earlier, she had returned from missionary work in northern Africa, her health fragile, her eyes forever changed. There had been talk, half-whispered in cloisters, about an experience she couldn't explain. Something unseen, something she said spoke without sound and pressed her to her knees in a place where no one else felt anything. She had come to Rome for a personal retreat. She wasn't supposed to be inside St. Peter's that day. Her name wasn't on the list. And yet, somehow, she was there, kneeling 3 rows from the high altar, directly in line with the pontiff. She did not move. She did not speak. She simply watched. And when she fell, softly, strangely, it was as if all the light in the basilica bent toward her for a moment and recoiled. The setting could not have been more precise. A sea of clergy robed in white, banners declaring Anno Misericordiae, the year of mercy, waving in the breeze outside. The host suspended in trembling fingers, and a young woman collapsing not out of weakness, but as if pushed by something far older than Rome itself. This was not just another scandal, not just another spectacle in a church battered by headlines and heresy. This was something no press release could sanitize, no doctrine could explain, no bishop could spin. The Vatican called it a medical episode. The press called it divine theater. But among those who saw her fall, especially those who stood closest, not one has described it the same way twice. Because something had shifted, not just in the girl, but in the air, in the altar, in the authority of the church itself. This Mass was meant to unify, to remind the world that the church, despite her wounds, still stood. But now, fissures had opened beneath the marble, fissures that no incense could hide. If this moment was more than coincidence, if you think heaven still speaks through suffering, subscribe. But if you believe this is all just ritual and drama, if your heart remains unmoved, then say so in the comments. But be honest with yourself, because something sacred broke open that day, and ignoring it will not make it go away. The Vatican press room had always been a theater of control. Even when chaos reigned outside, protests, scandals, fractures within the hierarchy, the tone inside those marble halls was diplomatic, clean, controlled. But not this time. Within hours of the girl's collapse, questions began circulating, not among the faithful, but among the media and the intellectual elite. They circled like birds over a battlefield, already scenting blood. The first inquiries were predictable, professional, but edged with accusation. Is the Vatican exploiting this tragedy for sympathy? Why hasn't her identity been released officially? Was the girl part of a staged narrative? Is the Pope weaponizing this moment, this emotion, for theological control? The questions fell like arrows, fast and sharp, during the emergency press briefing that followed the Mass. And when Pope Leo XIV appeared in person, unannounced, unguarded, the tension fractured into disbelief. No pope had entered a live press scrum in over a decade. But Leo was not a man of protocol. He walked into the chamber like a surgeon entering an open wound. Not hurried, not smiling, simply present. He bore no paper, no handlers, no notes, only the ring of Peter on his finger and something colder in his eyes, clarity. He stood at the podium, waited. The murmurs died. And then he spoke. When truth becomes too heavy to hold, he said, his voice low but unwavering. The cynical reach for distraction. There was no outrage, no rebuke, only a quiet dissection of the moment. Surgical, pastoral, unsparing. He did not deny the girl had collapsed. He did not spin it into poetry, but neither did he treat it as anomaly. He described it as a rupture, a tear between the seen and unseen. And in doing so, he stepped beyond the language of politics and medicine into the language of mystery. You ask me what role the church plays in suffering, he continued. You ask if this moment was staged. But do you ask what moved her soul before her body gave way? Do you believe only what you can predict, or only what you can explain? A journalist from Paris asked directly, "Do you deny this was theatrical?" Leo did not flinch. "I deny nothing," he replied. "But I invite you to ask better questions." The silence that followed was not polite. It was defensive, uneasy, as though the room itself recognized that something larger had been named. And then came the tremors, not in the ground, but in the narrative. A theologian-turned-commentator on Vatican News suggested the Pope had deliberately orchestrated the emotional tension of the Mass. A progressive cardinal from Belgium questioned the wisdom of turning a girl's suffering into liturgical spectacle. A secular news anchor called the entire event a performance of holy manipulation. The fractures widened. Some in the church recoiled from mystery, hungry for explanations. Others clung to their reason, their categories, their talking points. Still others, few, but vocal, began to whisper that what had happened at the altar was not political, but prophetic. Pope Leo did not answer every accusation. He did not chase down every speculation. He simply issued a short statement days later, sealed by hand, not staff. It read, "The soul does not collapse without a cause, and the world should tremble when it refuses to ask what that cause might be. If you've ever felt the world tries to explain away the sacred, subscribe. And if you believe the Pope is just avoiding hard questions, say so below. But know this, silence speaks too. And in moments like these, it often says more than noise ever could. It did not take long for reverence to rot into ridicule. By the third day, the girl's collapse had become fodder for debate panels and evening talk shows. The slow solemnity of the Jubilee Mass was dissected, memed, and mocked. Clips circulated with altered audio, overlaying Gregorian chant with circus music. A prominent secular podcast described the event as a masterclass in collective hysteria, blaming incense, ritual fatigue, and psychological suggestion. But the ugliest accusation came wrapped in academic authority. A professor of neuropsychology from Berlin wrote an op-ed titled "The Catholic Condition: How Ritual Can Induce Psychosomatic Collapse." In it, he claimed the girl had likely suffered a trauma-triggered neurological seizure brought on by the theatrical tension of the liturgy. "What we're seeing," he wrote, "is not spiritual warfare. It's mass delusion induced by sensory overload and conditioned religious guilt." Others echoed it. The church was accused of planting her, a stage fall designed to evoke awe in a faithless age. When Isabel's name was finally confirmed, so were her studies. Theology, patristics. Her quiet devotion was turned against her. Proof, they said, of deep indoctrination. A tool, a symbol, a narrative puppet. There were calls for transparency, demands to release her medical files, to provide camera angles, to prove she wasn't drugged, coerced, or worse. And always, humming beneath the surface, was the same poison suggestion. This was not divine. It was designed. Pope Leo XIV did not respond at first, but when he did, his voice had changed. He did not summon press. He did not call a council. Instead, he appeared unannounced in the crypt of St. John Lateran, where a group of seminarians had gathered for adoration. He stepped into the candlelight. No cameras, no guards, just robes, rings, and gravity. He began with a story of a priest he once buried in the jungles of Laos. The man had refused to flee when the village was overrun. Instead, he stayed with the lepers, held their hands, whispered the psalms to them as they died. When soldiers came, they beat him to death with the butt of a rifle. Pope Leo had arrived too late to save him, but not too late to bury him. And as he dug the shallow grave with his own hands, he said, "The smell of holiness and death were the same that day. Sweet, earthy, final." Then he spoke of another priest, imprisoned for decades in Siberia, with no sacraments but the ones he imagined. When Leo found him, the man had forgotten most of the Latin, but remembered every line of the Psalter. Then came the darkest story, one never shared publicly. He had once stood beside a child whose voice had changed mid-prayer, a child who knew languages she had never learned, who convulsed at the sound of the Eucharistic prayer, who begged, not for life, but for light. And when she died, the air in the room changed. Not colder, not warmer, thinner. He paused. "You asked me for evidence," he said, looking around at the young faces. "But when the world no longer believes in evil, what would proof even look like?" There was no applause, only breath held in reverence. He turned slowly to the tabernacle. "The world wants comfort," he said. But God offers truth. And sometimes that truth bleeds. The story of that night leaked, not through Vatican press, but through the whispers of those seminarians, some of whom had never seen their spiritual father weep until then. But the accusations outside grew louder. A lawmaker in Brussels called for a religious oversight committee, citing dangerous mysticism influencing global policy. A television host referred to Pope Leo as the last medievalist. A bishop in America publicly criticized the Holy Father's resistance to rational inquiry, urging a more pastoral posture rooted in modern science. But to those who had heard him speak in the crypt, science was not the enemy. It was simply inadequate. If you believe silence in the face of mystery is complicity, subscribe. If you'd rather ignore what you cannot explain, write why. But don't pretend you didn't hear this. Don't act like your heart didn't shiver. Because whether you admit it or not, something ancient has stirred. The press room was silent before he entered. Not quiet, silent. The kind of silence that builds not from peace, but from the weight of what is about to be said. Pope Leo XIV walked in without entourage. No crimson, no choir, only the white of his cassock and the heavy stillness of a man prepared to be misunderstood. He did not sit. They had arranged a chair for him, but he remained standing. Behind him, the old Vatican drapes moved slightly in the breeze, as if history itself had begun to breathe. The first question came like a knife wrapped in silk. Your Holiness, is it true that you're using this young woman's tragedy to revive a dying church? No reaction, only a blink. Then the second blow followed, sharper this time. Isn't this just a holy publicity stunt? You've rallied the faithful. You've stirred global media. You've made her collapse into a symbol. But symbols sell. So tell us, who wrote the script? A single murmur rippled across the crowd. And then, stillness again. The kind that forces everyone to watch the face of the accused. Pope Leo raised his eyes slowly. There was no anger in them. Only sorrow, ancient and personal. His voice did not rise. He whispered the truth loud enough for every soul to hear. When a child collapses in front of you, do you ask her for ratings or for forgiveness? No one moved. Outside, the bells of St. Peter's began to toll the quarter hour, as if the sky itself marked the moment. Then came the flashback, not imagined, not manipulated, but captured, from Vatican broadcast archives, from cell phone footage, from security angles that had never aired. The girl, Isabel, kneeling just before the elevation of the host, then collapsing forward with a thud that silenced thousands. A freeze frame, the host suspended mid-air between the Pope's hands. Gasps echoing through the basilica, priests frozen mid-breath. One bishop raising a hand in fear, not prayer. And then, the glow. Soft, subtle, undeniable, not staged, not lit by rig lights, but a light that shimmered behind her body, as if heaven refused to look away. The footage cuts. Back to the present. Pope Leo looks out over the room again. And this time his voice shifts. Not harder, but deeper. You say we exploit suffering, he says. I say you fear what suffering might reveal. No one laughed. No one coughed. A veteran journalist who once heckled cardinals at press briefings looked down at her hands. The air had changed again, not because of temperature, but because of confrontation. This was no longer a debate. It was a reckoning. Outside, some protesters chanted. Inside, some souls listened, but all were made to choose. Because in this moment, the Pope had turned the lens around. It was no longer the church under scrutiny. It was the world. If this moment gave you chills, you felt something real, don't scroll past it. Subscribe to Holy Shadows. And if you won't, say why. But remember, apathy is a choice, and choices echo far beyond the screen. Number 6. The silence was not broken, it was dismantled. Pope Leo did not gesture. He did not raise his voice. He simply began to reveal what had not yet been said. You confuse visibility with control, he said. You think because a camera was present, it was performance. Because it was broadcast, it was curated. But the church does not choreograph the holy. She does not summon miracles. She only tries not to mishandle them. His eyes moved slowly from one side of the room, to the other. No teleprompter, no notes, only memory and truth. He stepped forward just once, closer to the microphones, closer to the edge. You asked what happened to the girl. Let me tell you what you didn't ask. A rustle. Someone cleared their throat, unsure if they were allowed to. She had gone to confession that morning. It was not scheduled. She found a priest by chance. She waited in line like everyone else. When she entered, she said two things. I have to be clean before he comes. And I saw a light. I don't know if it was him or who was with him. The press room shifted. Not a word, but a sound. That subconscious movement when the body senses something it can't rationalize. She received the Eucharist less than 10 minutes before she collapsed. She didn't speak to anyone afterward. Not the nuns, not the guards, not the cameras, except for one sentence. One. He looked straight into the camera now, not just addressing the journalists, but the world. She whispered, "He's here, and he's not alone." No soundtrack was needed. No ominous strings. No dramatic cutaway. Because the silence was enough. Visible fear crept in like fog. A priest in the front row lowered his eyes and made the sign of the cross. One of the Vatican press officers stepped back against the wall pale. A nun in the corner pressed her rosary against her chest, eyes brimming with tears. And among the journalists, professionals trained to detach, to question, not a single hand was raised. No follow-up, no challenge. Not yet, because they knew this had pierced something deeper than politics. Pope Leo did not look triumphant. He looked haunted, not by doubt, but by the magnitude of bearing witness. You want a proof, he said, but you don't want what proof demands. Because if it's true, if he really was there, then everything changes, and that terrifies you more than any lie ever could. One camera angle caught a reporter swallowing hard, eyes glassy. Another showed a bishop looking out the window, lips silently moving in prayer. No notes were scribbled, no tweets sent. The room had forgotten itself, because something ancient had stepped in. If truth matters more than comfort, you already know what to do. Subscribe. And if you still think this was all manipulation, write your rebuttal below. But choose your words carefully, because you're not just debating us. You're speaking into eternity. The weight of what had been said lingered, not as controversy, but as a stillness too deep for debate. Pope Leo XIV did not press his advantage. He did not declare victory, because this was never a war. Instead, he breathed slowly and spoke once more, not as a judge, not as a strategist, but as a pastor. This girl's collapse, he said gently, was not a failure of body, nor spectacle for the cynical. It was a cry from heaven, not to shock us, but to remind us we are not gods. He paused, and this time, the silence that followed was not tense. It was sacred. She came to Mass like any of you, quiet, faithful, carrying the invisible wounds this world hands to anyone who believes too deeply. He looked across the sea of faces now, reporters, bishops, aides, but beyond them, the red light of the camera, beaming to millions who would watch this later, with headphones in dorm rooms, in prison cells, in hospital beds. This isn't about proving miracles, he continued. It never was. It's about not missing them when they arrive, because they don't come dressed in lightning and applause. They come in fragile moments. A trembling voice, a blinding light, a collapsed girl holding the host. He moved from the podium. He stood in open space. No barrier now. Just a man in white, before a world unsure how to listen. And if the sacred breaks into our world, even for one fragile moment, what kind of people will we be? He let the question breathe. Distracted critics? He let the words hang like a veil. Or awakened souls? There was no answer, but there didn't need to be, because somewhere across the signal waves, a grandmother gripped her rosary tighter. A lapsed seminarian wiped his eyes. A teenage skeptic paused the video and didn't know why. If you want to live awake, not numb, not proud, subscribe to Holy Shadows. And if not, then write why, but say it with reverence. Heaven might be reading. If you had been there, standing in that vast square beneath the soaring dome, as the host was lifted and the girl's body gave way, what would you have done? Would your knees have buckled beneath the weight of the moment? Would your voice have whispered a prayer, or remained silent in awe? Would you have dared to look, or turned away from what unsettled your soul? These are not idle questions. They reach deep into the heart of who we are, beyond faith or doubt, beyond ritual or reason. Because this channel, this story, is not for the proud. It is not for those who watch from a safe distance, entertained by spectacle or scandal. It is for those who still feel, who still tremble, who still hunger for truth beyond the headlines and hollow explanations. Here, we seek the shadows where holiness dwells, those quiet spaces where light and darkness collide, where the sacred interrupts the ordinary, where the eternal presses close to the fragile. May we all have eyes to see and hearts to tremble when holiness brushes close. Subscribe to Holy Shadows, not for us, but for the girl who fell at the altar and the voice she may have heard in that silence. And if you won't, then tell the world why. But do not hide. Not this time.